So we've finally gotten to the point where there's now going to be an investigation into the origin of COVID, and not just an investigation, but a bipartisan investigation in the Senate by the Senate Homeland and Governmental Affairs Committee. And that investigation is going to be headed by Rand Paul, of course, a Republican, and Gary Peters on the Democrat side. Now, a lot of people are getting excited about this. This is the one. Now we're going to finally get to the bottom of it. But then when you read the announcement, I'm not so sure anymore. I mean, there's 3 paragraphs in the announcement. The first one is sort of the compromise paragraph, and they talk about these fluffy concepts about, biotech and future and whatever. And then there's this tiny mention of potential origin of COVID, not origin of COVID, potential. It's like, we'll just kind of have a look at that broadly. And then Rand Paul's paragraph says, yeah, we're going to have a look at the origin. And then Gary Peters' paragraph doesn't say anything about origin. It just says, oh, we're worried about the future biotech stuff. So I don't know. What did you make of it?
Well, the first thought that I had, I went right back to the Senate Select Intelligence Committee's report on Russian interference. And the fact that what that really was, it was the last thing that it was supposed to be. It was effectively a whitewash of things that could be used down the road. So on the one hand, anytime you have these government committees congressional committees stepping into place, I think they're running interference. Now, I'm a little heartened by the fact that Rand Paul is on this. I'm a little heartened that we have participation from guys like Richard Ebright, on the outside. But it's like you said, we're already seeing the start of it with these disparate statements that, on the one hand, one's kind of soft and the other's just not. It almost seems dismissive. And I always tend to view these things as a cloak, as a means to be able to throw shade over things. And that kind of, I guess the proof's going to be in the pudding as we see this develop. Is it for real or not for real? My money's on it's not for real, despite the participation of Rand Paul. And that kind of brings us back to the more fundamental question of, you and I have been doing this investigative work for a long time, specifically on COVID, obviously. That kind of became a secondary specialty for the two of us. There's a lot of unanswered questions, but kind of the big picture, knowing what actually happened, isn't that hard to figure out. There's still details to be filled in. Now, if that's the case, why is the government so determined to keep this thing covered up and under wraps? And, that's kind of the big remaining question. And you and I have some hypotheses on that. But that's what I worry about. That at a bare minimum, let's say that this committee proceeds forward like any other normal committee, they're going to do a shit job. Let's say that they go into it with some honesty. I can imagine the intelligence community putting all kinds of claims of sources and methods, national security, et cetera, et cetera. That would be my prediction. So the question becomes why?
Yeah, and I agree with that prediction. First off, I think you're absolutely right. There's 2 ways of interpreting it. So the fact that they're calling it like bio defense and life science investigation, some kind of euphemistic word like that. 2 ways of looking at it, right? The first is, yeah, they actually want to investigate the origin of COVID, but they don't want to make it so obvious. So that's why they're giving it this euphemistic name about, they're just generally looking at kind of bio stuff. That's option 1. And option 2 is, well, they're calling it that because that's the compromise language, and Democrats just aren't interested. And as you say, the IC is going to stop it anyway. So I'm also like you in the latter camp there. So I'm not very hopeful. I do have to say that Richard Ebright, who of course on the sort of science side of this stuff has been at the forefront, not only since COVID arrived, but before. I'm always fascinated, even now, that guy, Richard Ebright of Rutgers, predicted not only this pandemic, but predicted who would create the virus and in which lab it would be created. And he predicted that in 2015. That's just, how must he feel that, all his warnings went unheeded. So he's more, optimistic than we are. Now, as to your second point with the IC, I think that's going, even if there is real hunger on the Democrat side as well, Peters, who knows, maybe this is just, calling it life sciences is just like the ruse, and he's actually into trying to figure it out. you're right. He has to jump over that hurdle or get through that wall, which is the IC. Now we know that Congress passed a resolution overwhelmingly that the IC has to release everything. And then they released nothing. They were like, yeah, well, forget about it. We're not going to do that. So how is this going to be any different? You know, you and I have been through this for the past 4 years. Every single FOIA, everything redacted. Everything has to be fought over. Some of the most important revelations of all, the one, for instance, where Fauci basically knew about all these engineered features and wrote it down in an email and talked about the mice, the ACE2 mice in the Wuhan lab and so on, that had come from Barrick. We still haven't seen those emails because they were, remember, they allowed like one House staffer or whatever into the skiff to maybe have a look. And then the House staffer quickly scribbled down whatever he could, That's the level of transparency, namely none. And I mean, what's your suggestion? I don't know how you're going to break through that wall.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have a suggestion because I don't know how you're going to either. It kind of cuts to the power of the intelligence community that if they don't want something to get out, they seem to always find ways for that to happen. And there's a lot of eerie parallels in terms of the way things are handled with the Spygate Russia collusion narrative. The same thing, all the hurdles that the Senate Select Intelligence Committee was really kind of participants. They weren't trying to investigate. But think about what Devin Nunes and his group were doing and how many obstacles they ran into at every turn. And the FOIA process has just gotten so bastardized. You sent out a tweet. Now, it was a FOIA, but it wasn't from the government, so it's a little bit different from a private entity. But it was the study on the impacts of the vaccine, and every single page. What was it, like 52 pages, something of that nature? Every single one of those pages was redacted completely, and the whole FOIA process has just become a joke. That's one of the starts. If there was a way that you could have some oversight, but I just wouldn't trust whoever was put into that oversight process either. I don't know if there's an easy answer to it, but their ability to hide behind the FOIA process and hide behind redactions is so frustrating. It's such an impediment. And they can just claim sources and methods. Going back to Ebright, you talked about, one of the things I think, first of all, in terms of his enthusiasm for this project, I'm grateful. I'm glad he's doing it. I'm glad to see that. For people who don't know, he's got he's got a sparkling resume. The guy's just, a brilliant guy, and has been right and has been leading the charge. But he's a little bit naive when it comes to how Congress and how politics works. He spoke to a reporter the other day, despite a number of us telling him, whatever you do, don't talk to the guy. I think he just kind of thinks there's, hey, we've got a door open and we have a chance, and you and I are a little bit more seasoned at this and are a little bit more jaded. And so our expectations are very different.
Yeah, no, that's right. In a way, I guess you assume as well that these hit jobs, especially against Ebright in the past few days, were kind of a shot across the bow before this new investigation was announced. Did you see it that way as well?
Yeah, I first of all, I think it's worth giving a little more backdrop to Ebright because it's pertinent to the discussion. And for a lot of people who don't realize, this guy was so much more involved in things than people were aware. He's one of the top scientists, virologists in the world. The FBI actually went to him in the early days of the COVID outbreak and brought him on to analyze what they were seeing. And very quickly actually opened up an investigation into EcoHealth, Peter Daszak's EcoHealth. Using Richard Ebright as a consultant to understand, all the specifics, the deep virology language that they were seeing, the genetic sequences. And very quickly that got stymied and went away. And that entire investigation got shut down. So, on the one hand, you've got Ebright, who's a lot more involved, I think, than people realize that he is, although he's talked about it publicly. And secondarily, you've got this intense effort to cover things up. Now, you talk about the shot across the bow. You and I would say, what do you think, Hans? Maybe 3 or 4 months ago, we suddenly saw this incredible, right at the definitive point in time where you and I thought, okay, we've now got virtually definitive proof that it was a lab leak. It's done. We've even, we've got pretty much every piece we need to say to be able to conclusively say 100% it's a lab leak. And out of nowhere, this mounted effort to attack anybody and promote a natural origin all over again. You and I were just looking at it, shaking our heads. Now we know where it's coming from, we understand it, but it was, really an impressive effort that now is only accelerated.
Yeah, I mean, let's just quickly kind of review what happened there, or what it is we found out. I mean, so there's this diffuse proposal from 2018, which no one knew about other than Daszak and Barak and Xi Zhengli of the Wuhan lab. And that proposal leaked in 2021, and you and I knew right back then and there that that's it. It came out of the Wuhan lab because they had a blueprint for making COVID, which is what this diffuse proposal was.
Now, and that's so not hyperbole, a literal blueprint.
A literal blueprint, that's right. So what happened a few months ago is that U.S. Right to Know, which is, by the way, a great organization, they're just like the dog that just won't give up, just pursues and pursues and pursues these FOIA requests. And they finally, through the U.S. Geological Survey, it's a long story, but they had this brilliant idea of going through that particular agency, which is probably not so into sort of the FOIA wars and so on. And maybe that's why they were more successful. And it was an indirect path to getting some of these documents through the Geological Survey. Brilliant idea. We can discuss the details some other day, but that's not the point. The point is they got the documents. And what those documents were is they were the drafts of the diffuse proposal. So up to now, or up to then, we only had the final version. And the drafts showed a lot of things. The long story short, they showed that in diffuse, they said this was going to be done in North Carolina. In the drafts, in private, in the comments on the side, they said, no, that's what we're going to tell the funders at the Pentagon, but we're actually going to do it in Wuhan. That's one thing. Another thing that was made clear in the drafts was that they really were going to insert furin cleavage sites into these viruses. That was sort of clear from the original leak, but it just became 100% clear. Another thing they did is they officially talked down the role of the Wuhan lab and the people there, like Xi Zhengli, but then in their private comments they said, no, once we get the funding, you guys are going to be driving this. So anyway, that was what you mentioned earlier, that when that came out a few months ago, it game over. This thing came out of the Wuhan lab, no question. And you're absolutely right. All these people came out of the woodworks on Twitter, in the newspapers, and so on, pushing back big time. It was, obviously organized. And now we've had the same thing again, but kind of preemptively going against Ebright and another guy called Bryce Nichols, who's also at Rutgers.
Bryce Nichols at Rutgers, yeah. One of the things also that people should be aware of, and they can see it for themselves, is just like what was done with the climate narrative, is they've created an echo chamber. And they keep utilizing and tagging and involving the same people who, by the way, happen to have been involved in the entire cover-up. So we're talking about people like Christian Andersen, Peter Daszak, Peter Hotez, another scientist who has affiliations, which he tried to cover up, to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. You have misinformation experts that have come in. Sander van der Linden, I think, is the guy off the top of my head. You've got newspapers. They pulled in a writer for the LA Times into this thing to write a hit piece on these guys. And they always tag everybody, and they tag each other, and they just keep building up, this echo chamber, this narrative that's ongoing. And if you push back against it, as both you and I have done, they'll block you. I got blocked by 2 different people yesterday as a result of a hit piece. And just everybody knows, they haven't been terribly successful against these virologists who are armed with the facts and armed with the truth. And as they began to realize that they weren't maybe winning that as well as they wanted to, they began to shift. And what they did is they went to their employers, and they've been trying to get these guys fired. There's 2 of them, I think, might even be 3, who actually they got pulled off. There's been a couple people who left Twitter because of pressure from their employers that was outside pressure that was brought on their employers that then was put pressure was on them. Wasn't it Martin Kulldorff was pulled out of Harvard? He was removed from his position.
He was. Obviously, Coverup is more on the lockdown and vaccine side of things. In terms of origin, there was a guy called Justin Kenny.
That's it.
I think, first of all, we have to say that in terms of, you and I don't, we can't go to a lab and do these experiments. We don't have that skill. We don't have that knowledge. I think we have gained the knowledge over the past few years of understanding these articles and understanding how the process works.
Right. We can read these things and understand them at a level we couldn't before, but we're not virologists.
Being able to follow along. So I can look at the diffuse proposal and I can say, look, this is where they wanted to insert this, and this is where they did that, and this is, So I think we've gained that kind of understanding, but we don't have that granular understanding. Obviously, these people have been doing it for many decades. That's their job. But the point is, and I think this is so important, that there's probably only, a handful or so honest ones, so honest virologists or honest biologists who are just honest in terms of not only understanding this stuff at a granular level, but then saying it. And so Ebright is one. He's kind of the original one because, as I mentioned earlier, he'd warned about that there was going to be COVID. He did that in 2015, and he identified the lab and the people, and he was 100% right. So the other one is Nichols. We already mentioned him. And then there's a guy called Justin Kenny, and he was one of them too. Again, there's very, very few. And Justin Kenny was pushed out. He sent this really cryptic message a few weeks ago, again, all in anticipation of what was going to happen with this investigation that's just been announced. And he basically said, because of my livelihood and whatever, I'm just going to not talk about the origin anymore. It's super cryptic, but, I think we all understood what happened there. So in a way, the only two that were left were Nichols and Ebright, and now they got. There was a phony ethics investigation launched against them at Rutgers, and then, as you said, this Hilsig character from LA Times came, into and piled on, and Science Magazine piled on John Cohen, our old. I don't even want to.
We could go on forever about Cohen.
Yeah, exactly. So they all came in with so. There's these two scientists at Rutgers, and there's an ethics investigation against them. And no one really knows who these. If you ask some guy, on the street, who's Bryce Nichols, no one has any idea. These are unknown to the general public. So, how's it news that a bunch of frauds like Anderson put in an ethics investigation or complaint against these guys at Rutgers? It's not news, but if it is news at all, it's the fact that the people who committed the fraud, like Anderson, are the ones who are pushing the investigation. But of course, that's not how it was reported. And so there was that ethics investigation, and then there was the media pile-on, and it all came ahead of this announcement of this new investigation. So obviously, those things are connected. And the other thing I'd say here is that so far, both Nichols and Ebright have just stood firm, like don't care. We're going to just keep telling the truth here.
Yeah, and for people who are finding that strange and thinking that, why are there only a couple truth tellers in all this? First of all, there's not many people. And again, the parallels and analogies to the climate situation are 100% apt. So NIH controls the grant processes for the scientific community, and we're talking about billions upon billions of dollars annually. And they obviously don't want anything to get out. And so you end up with this kind of, kind of a strange curve where you've got most of the people fall in the middle. And what they want is they just don't want any part of it. Even if they align with telling the truth, they just don't want to come under attack. So they stay out of the picture. Then you have those that are actively working to cover up the narrative. And on the other end of it, you've got the people that are trying to tell the truth. And this is just like what happened in the climate situation. Anybody who tried to speak the truth about, against the climate narrative came under attack. So most scientists just stayed quiet, kept their heads down. And that's what we're seeing here. And this attack, the fundamental basis of the attack too is just basically saying, oh, these guys are mean. It's immensely ironic that the group that works so hard, the Fauci-funded scientists that work so hard to actively censor people who are trying to speak out, so much so that they employed, Twitter and the big tech media companies, are the same ones that are crying about these scientists who are pushing back on them and now claiming that, they're acting unethically and they're effectively being mean to us. They're saying they're calling for violence, which of course they haven't called for violence. There's none of that. I was accused of for calling violence. I got blocked by the head of Duke Medical yesterday. He's a virologist there, a specialist, and he blocked me. And somebody sent me a screen image later, and wow, guys calling for violence. I said nothing of the kind. I simply said that this behavior is reprehensible in trying to censor people who are willing to speak out. So it's that narrative that's going on, and that culminated in the LA Times article that you were referring to. And, if anybody has a chance to go read that LA Times article, it's really something else. I believe there's a line in there where it says there is literally no evidence, no shred of evidence to indicate that there's any possibility of a lab leak. Well, unfortunately, that's a complete lie. All the evidence that we have indicates that there's a lab leak. There's no evidence that there's a natural origin. But you have complicit writers, just like John Cohen at Science. You have an LA Times writer that's fully on board and has been, and is helping this narrative of censoring these scientists. It's something.
And as you mentioned, it's always the same little cabal. It's always the same so-called journalists. It's always the same so-called scientists. So, for instance, the science, the article Cohen and the Hilsig guy in LA Times, they both got Anderson to comment. Well, Anderson is a fraudster. He wrote the proximal fraud, and he's been exposed as a fraudster because his private messages said the opposite of what the paper said. That's the definition of fraud. So they don't mention that. The Hilsig also chastises a guy called Andrew Huff. Now, I don't want to, you could think whatever you want about this guy, but the point is, if you're going to mention him, you have to mention that he was vice president at EcoHealth. He was literally Peter Daszak's vice president over there. So that's kind of important if you want to gauge whether you want to believe what this guy says or not. Hilsig doesn't mention that at all. Hilsig says something about Daszak feeling threatened or whatever, and then he jumps to the complaint. Oh, and then there was this ethics complaint against Ebrard and whatever. Well, Daszak didn't sign the complaint. His name's not on there, So he's just, the whole thing is an exercise in deception. That article. Now, I do want to just say we want to come back here to the why and how, but in terms of the cover-up, I understand, because I was in the same position just certainly before Russiagate, where I would have never believed that these kinds of cover-ups are possible, but it's there to see. And the reason, as you just explained, the main reason that is possible is that people are silent. That's the main reason. And I guess we all saw it in COVID as well, with all these civil liberty restrictions and so on. And most people just stayed silent because they didn't want to get into trouble, or their fear or whatever. And if you start off with a relatively small group of these virologists and a relatively small group of so-called journalists who cover that, it's very easy to control that group. So, for instance, sending out the ethics complaint against Ebrard immediately is going to shut up 95% of anyone within the scientist community who might have said something. Just that one act. It's fear for job, fear for all these things, and you have enough examples of people who no longer have a job. I mean, you just mentioned Kaldorf because he spoke up, and that has a chilling effect on everyone else. I would say that's like 95% of it, and the other part is people are greedy. People want grants from Fauci. People are generally cowardly. Whatever, you can come up with all kinds of reasons, but what I'm trying to say is it's not a big leap from cover-ups are not possible to, cover-ups are absolutely possible. You just have to have a few elements in place. And of course, here they are. But, I want to come back to something you said earlier, which is the why and the how. So I guess in terms of the how, we've worked out that we're not going to be able to break through the IC. They're just not going to release the information, whatever they have. So we're going to have to work with what we do have. And I think we have quite a lot. But what about the why? I know this is probably 10, 15 minutes ago, you asked, why? Why are they doing that? Why is the IC so adamant about covering up what happened at the Wuhan lab? And I think, I don't know. I mean, first of all, I don't know. I think there are some clues, and it could go in different directions. One of the clues, of course, came out of the Canadian lab scandal, from which we already talked about that on the show. But we found out from that the Wuhan lab had deep connections to the Chinese military. So from that point, it's not much of a leap to, well, maybe the American IC then also wanted to keep an eye on what was going on there. I would say that's sort of the more charitable view. The less charitable view is that the Wuhan lab was used to make these viruses kind of in tandem, that it was kind of a more of a cooperation.
Yeah, I was always struck by going back, and in the early days of the outbreak, China was accusing the U.S. And, that was sort of laughed at and dismissed out of hand as China propaganda. But unfortunately, there's a very real element of truth to that. What you can't get away from is the construction, the directions to manufacture this virus were put together through that diffused proposal. And that proposal involved Peter Daszak of EcoHealth, Shi Zhengli at the Wuhan lab, and it involved the godfather of gain of function, Ralph Baric at UNC, who, as you mentioned earlier, provided the humanized mice to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They tried to cover that up, but we now know that they did. So at a bare minimum, you've got that involvement. In other words, you've got the draft, the plan, sort of the technology, the technological know-how that was then given to Wuhan to go ahead and do their work. And for some ungodly, unknown reason, they decided to do the work at a BSL-2 lab, which to this day boggles my mind, not only doing it in a BSL-2, but they had a BSL-4 lab on the premises. I still don't understand that, but regardless, they did it. But I guess the larger point is there's these inescapable entanglements between both the U.S. and China, and you've got the DoD funding that went into NIAID and went in directly to EcoHealth as well. That's what the DARPA proposal, that's what the diffuse proposal was about. They were approaching DARPA, the Defense Department division, and asking for money. Now, they didn't need all that money, but they surely wouldn't have turned, they would have liked it. And so they were literally, as back in 2018, they were going to the DoD and asking for money to do this project. And the DoD seemed to think like, hey, it's interesting, but it's gain of function. You can't do that. So
yeah, no, I totally agree. The sort of between we were spying on the lab and we gave the lab all the technology. As a motivation for covering it up, I'm probably more with the we gave the lab all the technology and that's extremely embarrassing, or somewhere more along those lines. The spying is interesting, of course, because we know that the Canadian National Lab had a spy at that lab who was actually working for the Wuhan lab and indirectly working for the Chinese military. We already mentioned that. Now, we know that spy was over there all the time on like these false pretenses. A conference, or just these innocent reasons for being there. But we also know that Ralph Baric was there. He was there at the same time, and they actually had a secret workshop in 2018 that involved those people. So, what did Baric give them? Well, we already know Baric gave them mice, for instance. That's like highly advanced Western biotechnology. We also know that those mice suddenly showed up in another lab. So the Wuhan lab was supposed to use them just for these NIAID experiments, very narrow description, very narrow purpose of, you can have the mice, and then the mice were cloned and just kind of shared out and so on. As anything you give to China, that will happen. My reason for thinking more about this is about covering up embarrassment, or covering up embarrassment about like dual work, dual as in cooperative work with China, rather than covering up the spying activity, is I think they were just too dumb, by which I mean Western intelligence services. Look at the Canadians. Not only did they have a spy in their lab for all those years, but they allowed, this is the craziest part of the story, which hasn't even been told yet. They allowed the spy, Chu, at the Canadian National Lab to bring in another spy from China. And that other spy was a worker, like a scientist, a lab technician, some kind of worker at the Wuhan lab. So Chu said, I want someone else. I want that guy from the Wuhan lab to come over here to Canada. And I go, okay, fine. So in a way that tells me that just didn't really understand what was going on. And so for that reason, I'm more in the camp of...
I still struggle to see that don't understand as opposed to they maybe have ulterior motives or don't care. Because, I think you and I, just as, private citizens, have a pretty good handle that anybody from China, for the most part, that comes over has an embedded interest in the CCP, or maybe said differently, the CCP has an embedded interest in them. There's all kinds of pressure points, their families back there, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't, I can't imagine that the intelligence community doesn't know that that's the case, and yet they, kind of pretended otherwise. And as you said, not only was it bad enough they had the one, but then they had the request for a hand-picked individual, and they let that person come over, and that's crazy.
Well, if we were going to pursue
And that was a
theory,
high-level security, that was a BSL-4 lab in Canada.
it was. If
We're
we're going to
talking
pursue
Ebola,
that theory,
Lhasa,
the theory, I mean, in a nutshell, would be like, well, Daszak's real purpose was to spy on the Wuhan lab, and I just don't see it. I can see the attraction in that theory, and then that would cause embarrassment when the virus leaked. Hence, everything has to be covered up. But in my view, he's too dumb to fill that role. Would Barrick have spied on? That might make more sense. But then the embarrassment is more about the giving them the technology than it is about the spying. So in that theory, let's say someone like Barrick was like asked, hey, when you're over there, can you just kind of keep an eye on what they're doing and report back to us? Just like oversimplified, right? You have to give a reason to be over there. You have to give something nice. You have to kind of ingratiate yourself, right? So like, oh, here are the humanized mice Barrick gave them, right? And then we're all friends now, and now you're going to show me your lab, and then I'm going to report back to the USIC about this. Well, that could have happened, but that would still be incredibly embarrassing, because at the end of the day, no one found out what was really going on at the Wuhan lab. So the spying was kind of useless, but it was a net win for the Chinese side because they ended up with these advanced mice.
Yeah, and I still struggle with, we've now, in our last show, we talked a lot about this kind of earlier timeline for COVID, where it appears that, it might have been, still hard to pinpoint the date, but I think I'd feel comfortable in saying it was sometime between July and early September. As to when there was a likely lab leak, and I lean towards the earlier end of that scale. And I still struggle with the giant push for the mRNA vaccine that happened. I still struggle with Fauci talking out of both sides of his mouth, where privately he's pushing the mRNA vaccines, and publicly he's saying there's nothing to worry about in the grander scheme of things. I don't know. I have so many questions in terms of the actions that were taken, how that falls into the new timeline that we have, and just this resolute opposition from the intelligence community.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe we could close this out by showing a path that is possible, because I agree that resistance is just not breakable. You're just not going to be able to get through, and you're not going to get what you want in terms of all the documents and so on. But I think the path forward, and maybe we can close on this, is that there is actually enough out there to make to build a picture out of all the puzzle pieces. We have enough pieces, and you and I have discussed them many times on this show. We've discussed them many times on Twitter. It's all there. Plus, there's one thing that this new committee is going to have, which is of course subpoena power, and they can bring in people. And if they bring in the right people and ask the right questions, even a refusal to answer is in many ways an answer. So that's the path I would take. Just work with what you have plus subpoenas. I think the combination of those two things, and you're going to get all the answers you want.
Yeah, the only problem, though, is, as you touch on, we know there's a way to do this. There's enough public evidence. You and I have seen it. There's enough out there, but it involves political will, because you're going to need Fauci, you're going to need Collins, you're going to need Cadlick, you're going to need Barrick. You're going to need emails from NIH. You're going to need emails from UNC. Now, those are all readily obtainable. Is there the political will to actually do this? Or again, are we starting from a false premise where, this is really, even if Rand Paul's not on board with the idea, that this committee is really out here to provide kind of the final cover layer to it? And, my guess is that's what it is. we'll see as it proceeds. But, and, don't forget, they've got, with Ebright acting as, probably, I guess we're not certain of this, but effectively as an outside consultant, think about we know what he knows, largely speaking. If he just lays that out on paper, think how damning just that knowledge base alone is. Are they going to do that? We'll find out soon enough. But this idea that you have to have China's involvement to get to the bottom of COVID is a false narrative. So it will be interesting to see if they try to utilize that or not.